This is the In the Rabbit Hole episode archive project. What you're about to watch and listen to is a past episode from In the Rabbit Hole Urban Survival Podcast. You can learn more by visiting intherabbithole.com. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel now.
Here's two guys that survived a major shootout on the game Halo, Aaron and Jonathan.
Howdy, and welcome to episode 75 of In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. In this episode, it's a mashup of the Survival 7 and the Rule of Threes. I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Today's show is sponsored by Cat's Coffee. If you're looking for truly exceptional coffee to help you survive the morning or the next zombie apocalypse, you need to be drinking Cat's. They specialize in the finest coffee from sources that prioritize environmental responsibility and are fair trade certified. Their goal is to achieve perfection in every cup. Check them out at Cat's, K-A-T-Z as in zebra, coffee.com, or click on their bright green banner on the site and make sure you're dealing with an official sponsor of the show. Again, that's Cat's, K-A-T-Z as in zebra, coffee.com. This is your captain speaking. Today we may be experiencing a little bit of turbulence as it's raining, thundering, and lightning while I'm recording. I'm also a little sleepy because honestly I am one of those people that when it's dark and cloudy and raining and thundering and lightning outside, I tend to get a little woozy. So with that in mind, I'm going to do my best to steer this good ship Lollipop straight today, but we'll see what happens. And hopefully my timing is not made terribly off by these things, but let's get into it. So today we're going to talk about urban survival techniques. And to do that, we're going to use the Rule of Threes in conjunction with the Survival 7. Now first, you've probably heard of the Survival 7 before, but you probably heard it as in the Survival 4, or maybe the Survival 5, or the Survival 6. Everybody's kind of got their different flavor and taste on it, or spin, I should say. And really what it is, the 7 is the primary things that you should be focused on, and these are the aspects of survival that are the priorities. So it starts with shelter, water, food, energy, security, love, and then medical and sanitation. We put medical and sanitation together because they are so closely linked. They're really hard to separate. So normally you'd think of sanitation as being as its own thing. It's waste, your ability to keep your hygiene up, things like that. But if that fails, then medical becomes an issue. And so they're so tangled together, we just slap the two together as number 7. That's the best way that we feel priorities should be viewed. And as far as the Rule of Threes, the first time I ever came across the Rule of Threes, it was in Ragnar's Urban Survival book. It was a book I wrote a review on a long time ago. I will put a link to it in the show notes. It was an interesting book, but as interesting as it was also kind of a bizarre book. I was never really sure what the author's premise was, but when I came across the Rule of Threes, I thought this is a brilliant, simple way to really look at survival, and especially the concept of redundancy, because that's really what the Rule of Threes is all about. It's about redundancy. So the idea is that every major need should have 3 separate and distinct methods of supply. The author claimed that the Rule of Threes originated with I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, Nez Perce Indians, and that they strictly adhered to this philosophy and that they were very successful because of it. And I've also heard this mentioned by another author, and I cannot claim whether or not it was in the author's book, which I did read but can't remember. It was Life After Terrorism, which is a really good book, and I know we've talked about it on the show before. but I'm not sure if it was in the book or I did have a conversation at one point with that author, and it got brought up in the conversation. So I'm not really sure if it was in his book or just in the actual conversation. But as I said before, it's a beautiful, simple way of breaking down the need for redundancy within survival. Within the rule of threes, everything within the rule of threes, if we're going to look at it more carefully, can be broken down into three categories to make life simple and to have a better understanding of where we're looking to fill these needs and to bolster these needs and secure these needs. And the first would be storage, and that's what we have. That's something that we're all familiar with, whether call yourself a prepper or a survivalist or you're somewhere in between, as we talked about in a previous episode. Storage is kind of the most basic fundamental practice of anybody in the community. You buy or otherwise somehow procure something, you take it, you put it away somewhere, and it's there for the better part of a rainy day. The next one is procurement, by whatever means you're going to put into that. Procurement is what you can get, and whether that's through barter or some other form of commerce, however you want to look at it, it could also be scavenging, it can be a lot of things. And then the final category would be production, which would be your ability to make something, and that can be some craft that you do in some way, whether that be woodworking, metalworking, knife making, anything like that, gardening, dealing with livestock. That's all a means of production. And these are all the three areas that we should typically look at when we're considering how to apply the rule of threes. Now, we should also talk about vulnerabilities, and that's a very important part of the rule of threes and kind of almost the support for the rule of threes. And the vulnerability of storage is, we can look at our shelters, and our shelters can be subject to a natural disaster. Our shelters can be subject to pests that can either be bugs or people. That can also be injury, either from the shelter or from not having the shelter. The other problem with storage is that it's typically finite. Actually, not even typically. I can't really imagine an instance where any of us have the ability to store for an infinite amount of time, or at least infinite within the context of our own lifespan. Especially within the context of urban survival, space is at a premium. And that's a theme that's going to come up a lot, but space is at a premium. None of us have an infinite amount of space available to us. There's also an expiration on most things. Things break down. Either, if we're going to talk about shelter again, our shelters will break down over time. They don't last for forever. No matter how well we build them, human beings just do not possess the technical capabilities to produce any kind of shelter in any form or fashion or at any level of the conversation that will last indefinitely. And that's also true with food, with any kind of equipment or supplies. None of these things last indefinitely. Some of these things will actually outlast a human being. In fact, a lot of things will, but nothing lasts forever. And we've all heard that in our lives. There's vulnerability in procurement. Within the context of survival, there can be, in the more extreme examples, and even in just basic natural disasters, there's a breakdown of logistics, which supply chain. So as soon as something happens, whether we're talking about the mundane and normal, or we're talking about something really dramatic, there's always a breakdown in the supply chain. The ability for local stores to resupply themselves so that we can go in and procure them by buying them, that creates some real issues for a lot of us. There's also food and water, and there's a lot of issues around food and water as far as procurement goes, especially in an urban environment, and in a lot of cases also in rural. Another vulnerability of procurement would be barter. In shit hit the fan, grid down, barter may actually become an issue. You may or may not have stored whatever is going to be a commodity at that moment. Another issue that can arise is that in all economies, there's an ebb and flow of what is moving in an economy. So let's say, for example, you stored up some crazy amount of matches. That may become a very hot item, and it probably at points, it very it very may well likely happen. But come the next day, bullets may be the thing, or alcohol may be the thing, or cigarettes, or food, or medicine, or anything else. So it's not there's no real perfect solutions there, and barter can become an issue of procurement. There's also the vulnerability of production. Production, in any of the senses that we think about it, they're all going to be dependent on storage and your ability to procure, and also your ability to secure the process and output of that production, making sure that somebody else can't just come along and take what you have. And this is why we have 3 separate means for each one of them. And to get even deeper into it, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can have 3s inside of 3s. You can have 3 different locations for storage. You can have 3 different methods of procurement, and on and on. And you can make this as granular as you want, but in the beginning, keep it pretty topical. And I'm not going to really dig too deep into that. Otherwise, we could spend the entire hour just talking about how we can have 3s of 3s and then 3s inside of 3s. So why is this so important? We've talked about redundancy in the past, but maybe never to this level. I'm sure we've mentioned the rule of 3s in past episodes, but redundancy is important whether we're talking about preparedness, self-reliance, or self-sufficiency. There always has to be some level of redundancy, even in business. And when I work in my daily life, there's all kinds of backup systems to make sure that work and energy that is expended to produce product, whether it be intellectual or physical, that all of those things are safeguarded within reason and within profitability. And the same thing is true in all aspects of survival, that there must be redundancy. Every instance where there is not redundancy, we are that much more vulnerable. Now, obviously, there's always going to be vulnerabilities, even when we have redundancy, but every step that we take towards further redundancy is a step we take towards mitigating the possibility of vulnerabilities happening. So we cut them in half, do the math however you like, we start drilling it down and really making it so that these vulnerabilities that are all around us become mitigated and become less and less, or their impacts become less and less. And so to go on to applying the rule of 3s to the survival 7, let's first look at shelter, the main survival priority. Almost no matter whose set of priorities you look at, almost everyone's starts with shelter. So if we're going to look at it from a standpoint of storage, you've got your primary, whatever location it is that you reside in, wherever you lay your head down and have some semblance of control over that location. You can also have a bug out location. If it's something you already have, you have the stored capacity to reside in that bug out location, whether you've procured that bug out location solely as a bug out location or whether you've bought it as a second home that you vacation to often, that in the event of an emergency, you can bug out to. There's also the storage of skills. Our brains are these fantastic, not only processing, but storage devices. And that's going to be a common theme that comes up. It's been a common theme throughout the show, and we believe heavily in focusing more on acquiring skills than we do gear. And so storage, as far as knowledge and skills, is going to come up almost in every single one of these, if not in every single one of these points today. And within your shelter, that's the ability to repair your shelter, the ability to procure additional shelter, all of these different aspects of the shelter that we're in. There's also production, and production can be every day you go to work and you can be working towards a better, more secure primary location, something that fits your needs more. Or it could also be, and for most of us this is the case, that most of us do not own a piece of property somewhere else that's already got a shelter on it. And so maybe we're working towards producing that bug out location for ourselves or procuring it. Production and procurement will intertwine a lot throughout the show today. Procurement fits in when we consider hotels as bug out locations. Because if you're somebody that's in the position what we were just talking about, where you do not already own a bug out location, hotels are a great resource for a bug out location. Because most of the things that we're going to run into are going to be short term. And so it can be just a matter of getting out of your immediate area and going and staying someplace where that raises your survival odds. And hotels are something that we've also talked about in digital information packets when we did a show on that, and also when I wrote an article on it a while back. There's also procurement in the sense that family and friends allowing us to come stay with them. It's something that we're getting. And then there's what really honestly should be the absolute last resort, which is camping. A lot of people, especially new preppers, start off buying all this camping gear and trying to do all these things around that and thinking, I'm going to go someplace and just camp out. That should be an absolute last resort, no matter what the issue is. I take that back. There is one other last resort, and that would be some kind of community shelter or camp or something of that nature. But in both instances, the problem of security and other things arise. You're also dealing with issues where, like I said, it's a conclusion that a lot of new preppers come into. So it's kind of the first thing on everybody's mind. It's the first thing that people naturally jump to when we're talking about any kind of issue where people need to leave an area, is that, oh, well, I'll just go camp out somewhere. You and everybody else. That's going to be kind of really unpleasant in a variety of ways. And maybe one day we'll do a larger segment on that. But just for now, these are the options. And that's kind of the explanation for why camping is a last resort. Since a lot of these things apply no matter what the survival situation, I'm going to give some other points of interest that make this unique to urban survival. Within an urban environment, one of the bigger issues we have with shelter and any kind of a breakdown is the relationship between breakdowns and fires. That seems kind of out of the blue, but I first became aware of this issue a few years back. A news crew was camped out, or they had just stuck a video camera out, and there was a warehouse burning down in Galveston Island. And the camera was just capturing hours of footage of this building burning down. And the fire department was saying, no, we're not going out in the middle of a hurricane to put out that fire. There is no immediate danger to anyone's life that we're aware of in that situation, so we're just letting it go. And without systems of support, like our wonderful fire departments to put out those fires that happen on a daily basis, they would quickly spread and ravage a city because we're all in such close proximity in most cases. And we have a lot of people, let's face it, doing a lot of really stupid crap, especially in disaster situations. In an urban setting, there's also a limited resource. There's also a limited resource in rural and suburban areas, but as the population density goes up, so does the number of calls. So there's a real finite resource there. Security may also become problematic. And I say may, and I'm going to explain security. I'm going to explain why I said may when we get to security in just a bit. The other issue that we run into that's more uniquely urban is that, honestly, most of us lack repair skills. There's an interesting thing that happens, and this is a hypothesis of mine that I've based solely on observations, which is that the greater the density, the greater the specialization. So what we have in urban environments is a lot of people that don't really understand how to, or have the skills to repair the things that go wrong in their homes. The days of the man of the house handyman, in a lot of homes, that's pretty much gone. Everybody, what is the great expression is, just call a guy. Because we're so specialized and it's become so easy. You pick up a phone, and in a lot of major metropolitan areas, you can get somebody within an hour over to your house on almost any day of the week to fix anything. So we have that convenience, and we have that, you know what, I don't want to spend my free time, or I can't miss work to fix whatever this thing is. And we never did. And so now we've gotten probably about 2, maybe even 3 generations of that happening. It's just not even part of the urban culture anymore to fix our own homes. There's also a lack of materials available for repair. So in a rural environment where traveling an hour down the road to go get materials to fix something is really kind of a hassle, whereas where we're used to being able to go 10 minutes down the road to the local Home Depot, Lowe's, or Ace or whatever and pick up whatever we need to fix whatever we're having a problem with, if we have the skill to do it. In an urban environment, we're not going to store those goods, whereas in a rural environment, people are more likely to store those things. So those are some issues that are more uniquely urban in nature relative to shelter that create vulnerabilities to the storage, production, or procurement of our shelters. As far as water goes, starting with storage, I'd like to just add in here real quick that I've never been able to find anything conclusive as far as long-term storage goes. What I have done is I realized I had a 50-gallon plastic barrel of water sitting on a concrete floor somewhere, and I've taken a sample of it, and it's sitting on a shelf, and I desperately need to send it off to be tested to, at least in my mind, clear up the hypothesis that there is a danger of drinking old water in a plastic container that was stored directly on concrete. What you find is, and I've talked about this in a number of episodes, and a lot of people know that this is a pet peeve of mine, what you have is everyone, at least that I've been able to find on the internet, all pointing at different people who said the same thing, don't store water on concrete. No one pointing to any kind of a test that said long-term storage of water in plastic on concrete creates an issue. For that matter, I've never really been able to find any concrete research or anything that's even really conclusive about long-term water storage in general. There may be some interesting information somewhere or some conclusive information somewhere sitting in a book that someone's read. If you've found something, please email me in and let me know about it. Or even better, put it in the show notes and I'll go look it up and take a look at it. But in the meantime, like I said, I've got my own water, and eventually I'll get off my butt and send it in. And then I will release those results for everyone to see. But the different methods of storage are typically bottled water. That's probably the simplest and easiest. You go to a store, you pick up a case of water, you take it home, you put it on a shelf, under your bed, wherever. You put it somewhere in your location. There's also the method of water delivery services. That may sound a little funny, but somebody mentioned it to me, and we started doing it in our own home as a method of storage and rotation, and it actually works out really, really well. Locally, we use Ozarka, and they deliver the 10-gallon bottles, and every month they'll deliver however many 10-gallon bottles or whatever size of water that you've ordered, and it's this great system of you set it and you forget it. The only thought that really has to go into it is for the first month or two, maybe even 3. You kind of have to watch how much water you're going through and whether or not at the end of the month you still have left over what you'd like to. For the first couple of months, it may be a good idea to order a little extra so that you build up a back stock and then you're constantly rotating through it just like you would with food, which we'll come to in a bit. But it is a really great method of water storage that I found. It's an easy method of water storage. Getting into the more complicated stuff, there's cisterns, which are just giant water containers, and those can be above ground, they can be below ground. Typically, they're below ground. Above ground, even opaque or semi-opaque containers, if exposed to the sun, I have found that they will still grow algae to some small degree. Whether or not that algae is harmful in any way, I don't know. There was some in the barrel that I drained, and I guess we'll find out when I get that water tested. There's also, again, going back to acquired skills, there's the understanding of water and how to store water and whether or not water needs to be treated and the different methods of water storage. Procurement for water becomes a little tricky in urban environments, which we'll come to when we go into the uniquely urban environment bullet points of the show. But as far as procurement goes, there's trapped water. So we have water in our hot water heater. We have water in our toilet tanks, not the bowl. You're not a dog. Don't drink out of the water bowl, I guess, unless you're in absolute dire straits. There's also water that gets trapped in the pipes, and there's a way of getting that out which we'll either cover one day, or if you'd like to, there's a pretty detailed explanation in Tom Brown's Urban Survival book. Really great resource, by the way. There's also bodies of water that either running or lakes where if it's close enough and we can physically go and get water and bring it back, that becomes a means of procurement for us. Coming into production, there's rainwater. There's also diverting moving water and wells. There's three problems with those things in an urban environment. First of all, rainwater, you are completely at the mercy of Mother Nature. And we'll take Houston, for example, where I am. Houston, for most of my life, during the summer, you'd get some pretty good hard storms. And today was kind of a fluke. At least recently, last couple of years, as a lot of people know, Texas has been going through a pretty severe drought. And Houston, which was traditionally a very wet place, has become a very dry place. And this is one of the things that Jason McConnell and I, my partner in the Rabbit Hole Farm, have run into as far as looking at ways of supplying water to the farm. One of the things we're considering is rainwater collection. It's still something we're going to do, but I've really kind of come to the conclusion that it's not going to be a great solution, especially as long as this drought continues. Diverting moving water is, if you've got somehow you're in an urban environment and have running water on your property or through your property, then that's great, but it's in most instances that's very unlikely that you have that kind of water. The other issue with wells is it's something I've thought about. It's never something I've really investigated, but I've never known anybody in an urban environment to have a well. That could just be my area. That could be a pretty general thing that most people don't have wells or the means to drill a well on their property in an urban environment. Some other issues that we have as far as like going back to storage, this is something that we run into with everything in an urban environment. I mean, this is true in rural too. We all have, like I said, a finite amount of space, but in urban environments, we have more so of a limited amount of space available to us. So storage in a lot of people's homes becomes an issue of, where am I going to put all this water? Am I going to be able to store enough water for however long I foresee an issue happening? We also typically have high levels of pollutants in our ground soil and in any kind of bodies of water around us. So filtering water becomes an issue. That's an issue no matter where you go, but especially in an urban environment, I think. As far as bodies of water go, there's a greater strain on external methods of procurement and resources. So that lake you see nearby your house, if it comes to that, everybody's going to be going to it. What will probably end up happening is a lot of people will make the pollutants in the water worse than they already were because they don't have an appreciation or understanding of keeping that water clean, or at least as clean as it was to start with. Now, another thing that is a positive of the population density is actually economy of scale, which is the larger the population density, the more resources they have to fix an issue. They also have greater incentives to repair the infrastructure because they have more people screaming at them to get it fixed. And the public relations nightmare of being able to say this huge population is without. So moving on to food, as far as when we look at storage, you can start with the easiest way to cycle through food, store and cycle through food, which is to eat what you store and store what you eat. So this is a Ron Hood concept of you go to the store, and if you normally buy a can of something or a box of something, the next time you go to the store, instead of buying one, you buy two. And you do that in whatever increments or at whatever levels are financially good for you, and you go from there. And eventually you will build up your stores. With food, we run into there's medium-term storage goods, so things that are canned or in boxes or stuff like that, that's usually going to last about 7 years before we really have to be concerned with eating it. It may not taste the greatest, but pre-7 years, it's probably going to be okay for us. And then we can also get into the long-term storage goods, which are like the mountain houses and any of the other freeze-dried stuff. And then whatever measures we take to produce long-term storables for ourselves, whether that's buying a 50-pound sack of rice and sticking it in 5-pound buckets with O2 absorbers, or filling it full of carbon dioxide and letting it push the air out and then sealing it off, stuff like that. Then we also have, again, knowledge and skills, getting into that, knowing how canning works and knowing how any methods of producing storable food for ourselves. And with that, we can do a lot. Getting into procurement in an urban environment, there's small game in longer term issues that we could run into. A lot of this stuff today is going to be aimed at long-term grid down issues, but small game. So as unappealing as it sounds, there's always rats, and rats are a very popular dietary item of grid collapses around the world throughout history. Most of us have squirrels or any other kind of small game that is available to us, and how you go about procuring that is completely up to you. So, there's pellet guns, there's slingshots, there's suppressed 22s, my personal favorite. But again, all of these things are really greatly dependent on how grid down we're talking about here. There's also foraging. I took a wild edibles class a couple years back at the Houston Arboretum. It was a really good class. If you're in the area and you get a chance to take it, you definitely should. If they don't already have a class listed, I'll tell you now, you can get, and this is what we had to do, a big enough group of people together and let the Arboretum know that you'd like to take a class. You have this many people, and they'll coordinate with that person and get it on the schedule for you. Foraging, one of the things I learned during that class was that foraging can sustain you in your area, and the better you are at it, obviously, and the more skills you have and everything, the better you can forage and the better you can survive. But most of the things you're going to find out in an urban environment, or in most environments for that matter, there's a reason it's not on your dinner plate every night. And it was because they're items that have low, in a lot of cases, low nutritional value, and they weren't worth domesticating. So we're not talking about stuff that's going to be terribly tasty. There are certainly ways around that, but again, that gets into how much skill do you have. And then there's also, if we're going to talk about grid down, there's barter. So what do I have? How much food does my neighbor have or somebody else down the street have? And can I barter with them for food? As far as production goes, this is pretty common. As far as production goes, there's gardening and livestock, tending to livestock. I will tell you from personal experience, in an urban environment, it is problematic. You have the issue of availability of space, but gardening takes real time and real skill. And for the people that just buy the survival seed banks off TV or wherever and think, after something happens, I'm just going to stick these in the ground and feed myself, you are kidding yourself. It is a pet peeve of mine. I've mentioned it on the show before. These are not just things that you pick up overnight. And if you were 10 and saw your grandmother doing it or helped out in the garden, you don't know how to do it anymore. And you don't know whatever the nuances were that they knew. And maybe they taught you a lot, but if you were 10 and now you're 20 or 30 or older, you don't know how to do it anymore. I can tell you that right now. Livestock is problematic in the sense that it's very space intensive. You have to be able to produce enough food in your garden for that livestock. It's not easy. And it's not even in my own farm. That's not something I've been able to do, is get to the point where the farm is even remotely self-sufficient. Or actually, it's not even self-sufficient at all. It's every week, or not every week, every couple of weeks, I'm making a trip to the local feed store to pick up rabbit feed and chicken feed and all those things. And eventually I'd like to get the farm to the point where maybe I can offset that, but I don't have any delusions that maybe I once did, that really is a short-term possibility of being able to produce enough from my own garden to take care of my own livestock. Things that are uniquely urban, again, there's less space available for it. There's less space available for the storage of food. There's a lot less space available for the production of food. And going into population density, there's less availability for procurement. In any kind of issue where we've had a grid and logistics break down, everybody is pretty much in the same boat. So whatever you're able to produce or store on your own is kind of where you're going to be at. And going back to economies of scale, there's more incentives for companies, because now most likely if we're talking about food, we're talking about companies that are involved and not municipalities. But there's more incentive for a company to load up a couple trucks full of food and take it to a large urban environment because they know they're going to be able to move that product a lot more quickly than if they go to a rural environment. There's also, and this may seem distasteful, but it is a fact of economies, and that it also produces a public relations incentive for a company to go deliver, for a company to show up with a couple hundred trucks and start filling up the grocery stores and getting people fed again. There's a lot more of a public relations incentive for companies to do that in a urban environment than there is a rural environment. Obviously, they're going to do it irregardless, but they have if it's a choice between giant metropolitan area and small town America, they're probably going to pick, giant thriving metropolis first. And they're going to get their photo ops of hundreds of trucks barreling down the road and unloading all this food and stuff. And I mean, you see Walmart doing it all the time whenever there's a disaster somewhere. And that is a great thing. And that's wonderful that they're doing it. And I'm sure that in some part they are doing it out of the goodness of their heart, but they're also doing it because it is in their best interest as a business to show we are a supportive member of the community. We're here to help when there's disaster. And in a lot of cases, they also give away stuff. Energy being the next survival priority. Energy is kind of a funny one, and it's typically referred to as fire. And really, when they say fire, that is the ability to regulate your body temperature and to keep your environment at sustainable, livable, survivable levels. Well, that takes fuels. And storing fuels for energy can be very problematic. But there's also the storage, again, of knowledge and skills as far as the ability to later produce or procure. But energy is probably one of the most problematic of all of these priorities in the context of this show. And as far as procurement goes, again, we're back to bartering or even scavenging, depending on what kind of weather we're talking about here and what kind of situation we're talking about here. As far as production goes, there's solar. We'll start with that one. I had a long conversation with a local solar company, and I'm not going to bring up their name because I ended up having a pretty bad experience with them, and I can't really say that was a company-wide issue or if that was just one raging idiot that happened to be working for them. But I did glean a lot I ended up speaking to the guy for about an hour, I think, and I did glean a lot from the conversation. And to start with, solar is not magic fairy dust. You don't throw a few panels on your roof. You don't throw a few panels in open spots on your property and boom, you're off the grid. It doesn't work that way. It has very limited production capacity. It is obviously very dependent on the weather and how much sun you're getting. In most cases, the panels are very easily damaged. Solar is also cost prohibitive. I was looking at putting panels on a 40,000 square foot building, and I want to say filling up every square foot, and I want to say filling up every last square foot of the roof of that building with solar was going to cost in the neighborhood of about $500,000. And we still were not going to take that building off the grid. And that building does not really use up much more energy than most buildings of that same size. Actually, in most cases, I would say that building requires a lot less energy than most other buildings, because for the most part, it's primarily warehouse space. But it's still, one day solar will get there, but it's not today. And it's probably not going to be anytime really soon. Generators are another option as far as production goes. However, again, they're dependent on how much fuel you can store, or they're dependent on the grid. And with that said, it is traditionally believed that gas systems are extremely resilient and they would be the absolute last thing to go down. However, those lines can be easily damaged in your area, and while the rest of your urban environment could have gas being supplied to them and they could be running their generators just fine, you may end up with nothing. So being dependent on a natural gas powered generator poses some definite vulnerabilities. As far as exotics go, like wood gasifiers and things like that, That's outside the realm of anything I've ever really gotten into. To say that I'm aware of them would be one thing. To say that I really have any serious clue about how well they work, how efficiently they work, or how easy they are to maintain, I'd be lying to you. And that's one thing I don't like doing, is lying to you. So I'm not going to do it. But those are other things if you want to look into them. As far as energy, we've touched on a few of them, but unique to urban survival, again, we have less space available for storage and less space available to us for production. In the sense of generators, a lot of cities have rules about, and these are pretty good rules for the most part, about how close and exactly where relative to your structure a generator can be. So a generator may actually work out that there's no way you can put a generator on your property. That is, of course, something that you would need to speak to a generator specialist about. But in an urban environment, the smaller the property you're on, or the less grass space you have, so to speak, that becomes more and more of an issue. And with population density, we see energy falling much in the same way that water and food did. There's more incentive for companies to quickly repair. There's also more resources available to fix those issues. So that's something to be aware of, that there is actually that positive there as far as an urban environment goes. Security becomes a pretty big topic, and I think in some ways people worry about security too much, and in other ways people worry about security too little. And I think one day we're going to devote another entire show to security and go over those topics. But to stay inside the confines of this topic today, as far as storage goes, well, there's storage of guns, there's storage of bullets, there's storage of other bullets, but more importantly, and always as far as we're concerned, more importantly, there's the storage of acquired skills. So can you use and can you produce those weapons? And as far as procuring goes, this is where security and your community come together, which is in that you can form a community, and the more eyes in that community available, the easier it becomes to secure an area, depending on how bad of a situation we're talking about, obviously. And as far as production, this one's going to be a little weak, but as far as production goes, the only thing I've ever really been able to come up with as far as security and production goes is your ability to learn the skill, and then your ability to turn around and teach others that skill, and to be able to quickly equip others. And as far as points of security that are unique to an urban environment, I said earlier I would bring up the topic of why I said may. There's a concept we've brought up on the show a couple times that, as far as I am aware, it's a concept that we've brought up, which is societal context. And that is, what is your local culture already? If you're in an area, let's say, where if a unicorn farts, there's a riot, then you're going to have issues. At the same time, there's lots of examples of, and we can even look at Fukushima, where you're on the verge of a nuclear meltdown and everybody is pretty calm and just goes about things and tries not to get in the way or be a hindrance in general. So it really depends on what the local culture is. I mean, there's some other dependencies too, but that's kind of the big one. The other dependent is the type and duration of the breakdown. So if we look at Fairfall's book, which is the name that has just completely slipped my mind, I'll put it in the show notes today. He talked about that in his area, you were more secure in an urban environment than you were in a rural environment. But there's another guy by the name of Selko who had some forum posts that detailed his experience of survival in the 1990s Balkan issue that arose. And Jack Spirko actually recently got an interview with that guy. If you get a chance, would definitely go check that show out. It's very interesting. It's a little hard to hear, but it's definitely worth listening to. And he painted a completely different picture of whether urban or rural was better. So there's a lot of dependencies as far as security goes. There's a lot of nuances. It's anybody that tells you one automatically is better than the other is not looking at the full picture and is not taking into account historical evidence of issues where security's been better in an urban environment and where security's been better in a rural environment, or where survival has been better in one or the other, because it all depends. It depends, again, on the type and duration of the breakdown. Population density in an urban environment is an issue again because of the inverse relationship that happens. And it's kind of a strange one, and we may not really think of it often, but the denser a population becomes, the more difficult a community becomes, which seems weird. And I think and we'll come to a little bit more in just a bit when I cover the topic of love, but it becomes difficult in that while we do all need human contact, we also need some sense of space. And when we don't have enough space, then we become very guarded. And so there is a balance that has to be reached. People can very easily in an urban environment become much more standoffish and much more difficult to band together and join and become part of a community and work together in that instance. And in a lot of instances, as is very common in an urban environment because of the inverse relationship in urban density, is that in a lot of cases, we don't know our neighbors. And if you don't already know your neighbor and don't already have a relationship, it's very hard for them to trust you. And it's very hard for them to say, yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about, we should listen to him, or woman for that matter. Urban environments are also harder to cordon off. So if you think about the neighborhood that you live in, unless you're in a more suburban area where you have more isolated neighborhoods that have very distinctive routes in and out, those could be rather easily cordoned off. However, if you're much deeper into the urban environment, that becomes much more difficult to do because it's where do you draw the line? Where do you stop your block? Where do you stop however many blocks you're going to try to cordon off and barricade and restrict access? You also have, I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about this, which is you have less distance to see things coming. And that cuts down on the amount of time you have to think about and react to things, whether they are friend or foe, whether or not it's just somebody passing by, or whether or not it's somebody that means to come do you harm. So the issue of security becomes much more fast-paced in an urban environment. I said I was going to talk about love in a second, and it's not in a shiny, happy people kind of way, but it was a survival priority that was originated, as far as I know, by Ron Hood. And he talked about it in the sense of, you can go this long without food, you can go this long without water, and you can go this long without love. And it was the first time I've ever heard anybody talk about it. And I don't remember that Ron Hood really expounded upon it, but I've personally expounded on the concept a little bit and consider that priority as community as a whole. So it's not necessarily the romantic sense of love. It's the sense of love of your neighbor. And how on earth do you store it? Do you put your loved ones in a little box? No, that would probably be highly inappropriate. I'm pretty positive, actually, that would be completely inappropriate. But think of storage as your existing relationships. And again, your knowledge and skills that you've acquired and stored in your brain to form new relationships. And then we can get into procurement. So then using those knowledge and skills to form new relationships, either immediately before, during, or after whatever issue has arose. In production, well, production and procurement in this sense are almost one and the same. It's one of the few areas where we can't easily separate the two out. And uniquely urban, for the most part, this got covered under security. But again, there's the inverse relationship in density. The denser the population, the harder a community becomes to form, and the harder it is to form relationships in a lot of cases. The more work they take, the more effort you have to put into somebody trusting you. The flip side of that, and this goes very much in hand with the point that was followed through several others, which is that there's the economy of scale. And as far as communities go, it's the John Haywood quote that we've quoted often, which is many hands make light work. It is exactly what it sounds like on its face, which is the more people you have available, those people are resources. I mean, that's what community is. It is a resource. And so the more people available to help with work, and whether that be cleanup after a fact or rebuilding or whatever we're talking about, it's going to take human hands. And the more you have available, the faster that work goes. And you also have a greater diversity of skills that you can probably draw from. Again, I'm going to say probably there. Medical and sanitation, the two that I said go arm in arm and cannot be unlinked. And that really is. They are too closely linked, as I said in the beginning, to unlink. They're too interdependent and too important, and they play off each other entirely too closely to be able to separate the two in their own individual points. And as far as storage goes, there's the consumables when we talk about medical and sanitation. You can talk about bandages. You can talk about whatever methods you're using to dispose of waste, human waste, whatever it is. There's equipment in both. There are those 5-gallon buckets that you can put a toilet seat on and do your business in. And then in medical, obviously, there's a lot of different equipment in medical. And I'd like to point this out real quick before I get past the equipment one, which is a point that we've brought up, and I believe we definitely brought up with Ron Davis. Our feelings about medical equipment is that you really shouldn't go out and buy up a whole bunch of medical equipment. Learn how to use it. And once you've learned how to use it, definitely go buy it. But have a firm understanding of what you're doing with it before you buy it. As far as the argument that you have it available should someone else come along that does have that training, that's kind of a fart in the wind a little bit, because you're taking a big chance on whether or not somebody actually does show up or not with medical training. And so, again, as we've talked about in the shows about personal responsibility and stuff, if you feel that that medical equipment is important and it's stuff you want to have, then it should be twice as important to you to go get the skills. Also, that again, we have skills and knowledge in the storage section, so make sure you put those away in your brain. Procurement, again, we're back to community, being able to pull from community. And if we are going to find somebody that has extensive medical experience beyond what we have the time and ability to go get, you can draw from your community. Hopefully, if someone is there within your community that has that experience. I can tell you that in about a 4, maybe 6 block radius of my house, there's no one with much medical experience whatsoever. I probably have more medical experience from going to Red Cross and all that fun stuff and CERT than anybody else in my area. And that's definitely some, but that's not a trained EMT, paramedic, or any kind of physician. As far as production goes, there's always learning about herbs and alternative medicines and really getting into that, and then using as part of within your food production environment, doing those herbs. And I know that one's a little further out there for a lot of people, but depending on how far of a grid down we're talking about, it may be your only option. So it's definitely something to consider. I know it's a skill that I've long considered picking up. It's not high on my priority list at this exact time, but it is definitely one of my skills lists. As far as uniquely urban, we run into the issues of, since we do have a greater density, urban environments will run through medical supplies more quickly. We're more likely to have, because we are in closer proximity, we're more likely to have physical confrontations with one another that could require medical attention. We're just as likely as any other environment to do stupid things and hurt ourselves and require medical attention. But there's a lot more people doing a lot more dumb things and getting themselves hurt, requiring medical attention, and burning up the resources that are available to us as far as formal institutions go. But then again, we are also back to economy of scale. So you have a large population. There are more incentives for companies that deal in medical supplies and things like that to go in and resupply a large urban environment. And then, of course, the public relations. Survival in an urban environment definitely has its upsides and its downsides, but so does rural. One day we will come to an urban versus rural show. I'm not really ready to do that show yet. We've got so many other topics we want to cover. If you're in an urban environment, then you probably mean to be there, so I don't really feel a strong urge to make the argument for or against yet. But as I said briefly before, there are both positives and negatives in both environments. And is one better than the other? It depends on the type and duration of the event. I've thrown a lot of points and a lot of information and things to consider today. And as we've always talked about, we believe strongly in a balanced method of approach to fulfilling all of your needs and vulnerabilities. So start with the basics, the things that are most likely to occur in your life, and move out from there and move out to your level of comfort. And that's an important distinction because we talk about bottom up to level of comfort quite often. That doesn't mean that we're not concerned about more dramatic things. We don't often talk about the more dramatic things because if you prepare for the simple stuff, you'll be 80% of the way prepared for the more dramatic stuff. The purpose is, it's a general rule, just to keep everything simple and to keep things easy and calm. And part of this reason is, and just as we talk to you about it, and if you were going to go talk to others about it, it's the easiest way to talk to others without overwhelming them. And it's the easiest way for us to talk to you about it without overwhelming you. And with that, we wrap up episode 75. Thank you for joining me. This has been an episode from the In the Rabbit Hole Urban Survival Podcast. You can learn more by visiting intherabbithole.com. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more great survival stuff.